used a $180,000 John Deere for exactly one harvest. Then he gave it back. The whole town laughed. A broke single father, living on day labor wages, thought he could play with something other men spent entire careers paying off. They called it stupidity, wrapped in stubbornness. They called it a lesson he deserved. 3 days later, he bought something so cheap, so rusted, so beneath dignity, that nobody bothered to look twice. 1 week after that, the entire county went quiet. Not because Ethan Cole got rich, because they finally understood he had never been playing their game at all. The alarm never needed to go off at 4:30 inches the morning. He had been awake since 3:47, lying in the dark on the left side of a bed that still felt too wide, listening to the particular silence of a house where one person is missing, not gone in the way people leave for work or travel, gone in the permanent way, the kind of gone that rearranges the air inside a home so that even years later, on ordinary Tuesday mornings, you still reach across the mattress out of habit and find nothing. He stopped doing that sometime in the second year. By the third, he had simply stopped lying still long enough for it to matter. The farmhouse on County Road 7 had been built in 1941, and it showed its age without apology. The back porch sagged on the eastern corner, where the ground had settled. The kitchen window above the sink didn't quite seal at the top, letting in a thin whistle of wind that was worse in January and merely annoying in October. The roof over the second bedroom had developed a soft spot above the closet 2 winters ago, and Ethan had patched it himself with materials he bought at cost from a hardware supplier in Millhaven, who owed him a favor from a fencing job 3 summers back. He kept a running list of repairs in a narrow spiral notebook he carried in the chest pocket of his work jacket. Not a wish list. A sequence. Item 14 was the porch corner. Item 19 was the window frame. He was currently on item 11, the drain pipe along the north wall that had separated from its bracket and leaked during heavy rain directly onto the electrical junction box below it, which was a problem that could not wait, regardless of cost. He managed the house the way he managed everything methodically, without panic, accepting that urgency and crisis were different things, and that only one of them demanded immediate action. By 4:45 he had dressed, boiled water for coffee, and eaten 2 pieces of bread with peanut butter standing over the sink. He checked the notebook. He looked out the window at the fields behind the property, which were not his fields, which belonged to the Hartley family who paid him by the hour to work them during planting and harvest. The sky was the color of old iron. At 5:10 he climbed the stairs to the second bedroom and stood in the doorway without turning on the light. His daughter, Lily, was 8 years old and slept with the deep, total commitment of children who have not yet learned to be anxious about sleep. She had her mother's dark hair and her mother's way of curling one hand under her chin. On the desk beside her bed were 3 things. A library book about soil science. She had checked out twice already. A tin of colored pencils, and a drawing she had made last Thursday of the Hartley fields. As seen from the road, not a pretty drawing in the way children's drawings are pretty, but a precise one, divided into sections with different shading techniques for different areas, labels in careful block letters at the margins. Ethan had stood in this doorway looking at that drawing for longer than he intended. He closed the door quietly. His neighbor, Carol Dunmore, a retired school teacher who lived a quarter-mile down the road and kept chickens and an extraordinary vegetable garden, came at 6 to sit with Lily until the school bus arrived. This arrangement had been in place for 2 years, maintained through a combination of genuine affection and a quiet, practical understanding between 2 people who knew how to help without making the helped person feel small. Ethan was at the Hartley farm by 6:15. He worked hard and carefully and rarely spoke, unless spoken to, which most people in Larimer County interpreted as unfriendliness or perhaps simple dimness, the way people sometimes assign a blank expression to a shallow mind, when really the expression belongs to a mind that has other things to do. The Hartleys were decent people who paid on time and didn't hover, which was all Ethan required from an employer. He had worked for 3 other farms over the past 2 years: Sutton's operation to the north, the Brennan Brothers place, and a large commercial spread outside Ridgecrest, whose foreman changed every 18 months like clockwork, and whose systems were accordingly a disaster, but they paid well. He took notes on all of them, Not obvious notes. Not the kind of notes that would have required explanation. Just observations recorded in the narrow notebook in his chest pocket, in his own compressed shorthand, soil readings, drainage patterns, microclimatic variations he had noticed from driving the same roads in all seasons, the way certain fields held moisture differently at the northeast corner than the southwest, the way the light hit the ridge above Clearwater Creek at 2 in the afternoon, and what that implied about growing degree days. He had been collecting these notes for 22 months. He had been an agricultural systems researcher for 11 years before his wife, Sarah, got sick. And before he had moved home to Larimer County to be near her family during the treatment, and before she died on a Wednesday morning in April with the window open and the smell of thawed ground coming through, and before the research position he had been offered in Fort Collins quietly rescinded itself when he couldn't guarantee a start date, and before he realized, slowly and without drama, that he was now a 40-year-old widower with an 8-year-old daughter in a county where the main industry was farming and the main culture was skepticism toward anyone who hadn't grown up turning this specific dirt. He had never told anyone about the research background. Not the Hartleys, not the Suttons, not anyone at the feed store or the equipment dealership or the diner in town where he sometimes stopped for coffee on Friday mornings. It had not seemed relevant until the day he drove to the AgriLease office in Millhaven and put his name on a contract for a John Deere 9R Series tractor at $182,400. The woman behind the desk, whose name was Patricia and who had worked there for 16 years, looked at him across the paperwork with an expression of careful neutrality. "You're aware of the terms," she said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," Ethan said, "and you have the collateral documentation. Right here." He had liquidated everything. The small investment account Sarah had maintained before she got sick. The life insurance settlement, which had been modest but real. A parcel of land he co-owned with his brother-in-law in Wyoming that they had never agreed on what to do with. It had taken 8 months of careful, quiet maneuvering to assemble the collateral. And it had left him with almost no financial margin at all. He signed where Patricia indicated. That evening, he sat at the kitchen table while Lily did her homework across from him. "Bud," he said, which was what he had called her since she was 3. She looked up. "I'm going to be doing something different this spring. A project of my own." It might look strange to people for a while. Lily considered this with the gravity she applied to most things. What kind of strange? The kind where something looks like a mistake before it turns out not to be one. She went back to her math worksheet. After a moment she said, without looking up, "What if it does turn out to be a mistake?" Ethan looked at the notebook on the table beside his coffee cup. 22 months of observations. 11 years of research methodology. A very specific plan that had existed in his mind for longer than it had existed on paper. "Then we'll know exactly what we did wrong," he said. "And that's worth something too." Lily seemed to find this satisfactory. She went back to her homework. News in Larimer County traveled the way news always travels in small agricultural communities. Through the feed store, through the diner, through the particular information network that exists between men who spend long days on equipment and shorter evenings in each other's company, trading observation in the casual shorthand of people who have known each other their entire lives. By the end of the first week, everyone who needed to know had heard. Rick Dalton heard it on a Tuesday from Dave Sutton, who had heard it from Patricia at the AgriLease office, who had said nothing specific, but whose expression had apparently communicated volumes. Rick Dalton was 53 years old and had farmed the same 600 acres his grandfather had broken in 1962, and he had opinions about most things and shared them freely, which had made him something close to a social institution in the county, the kind of man whose voice in a room creates a kind of gravity that pulls other voices into agreement. He was not a cruel man. This is worth establishing. He was not the kind of person who enjoyed other people's suffering. He simply had a very confident relationship with his own understanding of how the world worked, which is its own kind of cruelty. The ambient kind. The kind that doesn't require intention. At Harlan's bar on a Thursday evening, Rick set his beer down and shook his head with the fond exasperation of a man confronting something almost too absurd for anger. "Cole," he said to the 3 men around him, Dave Sutton, a younger farmer named Brent Mackey, and a retired seed salesman named Gerald Hoff, who came to Harlan's mostly for company. The day laborer signed a lease on a 9R. "You're kidding," Dave said. "Patricia called her cousin who called Janet Farrow, and Janet told my wife." He put up everything he has as collateral. Everything. Rick paused for effect. For a single-season lease. The silence had the quality of something almost respectful, the brief, genuine bewilderment people feel before they know how to react to something. Then Brent Mackey, who was 29, and tended toward performance in social situations, said, "What does a day laborer know about running a 9R? "That's what I'm saying," Rick said. "Guy's been walking other people's fields for 2 years taking notes in a little book like he's a student. Now he thinks he's going to make his fortune on one season with a machine he can't afford to fuel." The laughter was not loud. It was the quieter, more settled kind, the laughter of men who feel confirmed in something they already believed. What none of them knew was that Ethan Cole had walked into Harlan's bar that same evening to pick up the to-go order he had called ahead. He came in through the side entrance, past the bar, and heard his name before he saw the table. He heard the tone before he processed the words. He stood at the bar and waited for his order. He did not look at the table. He did not alter his expression. Marcus behind the bar, who was young and observant and did not participate in the social architecture of the older men in the room, watched Ethan with a careful neutrality, then slid the paper bag across the counter and said, "Chicken and the pasta, like you called. You want extra bread?" "Please," Ethan said. He paid, took the bag, and left through the side entrance. He had parked 2 streets over. He sat in the truck for a moment with the engine off, the paper bag warm on the passenger seat. Not composing himself, he had not been destabilized, just sitting, the way he sometimes did in quiet moments, letting himself be fully in the present tense of a thing before moving forward. Then he started the engine and drove home. Lily was at the kitchen table when he arrived, finishing the last of a drawing. She looked up when he set the food down. "Were people talking about you?" she asked. He looked at her. "What makes you ask that? You have your quiet face," she said, "the one that's quieter than usual." He sat down across from her. "Some people think I'm making a mistake." She folded the drawing carefully and set it aside. "Do you think you're making a mistake?" "No. Then they'll find out eventually," Lily said, with the precision of someone stating a mathematical fact, and opened the to-go container. Ethan watched her for a moment. Then, he opened his own. He thought about telling her more about the plan, the specifics, the methodology that had been building in his mind for nearly 2 years. But she was 8, and she trusted him completely, which was itself a kind of anchor he was careful not to abuse by burdening it with adult anxiety. So he ate his chicken and listened to her describe a disagreement at school between 2 of her friends about whether the cafeteria's Wednesday soup was actually bad or just different, and he responded to the details she shared. And he laughed once when the story required it, and when they were finished eating, he did the dishes while she read in the living room, and the house was quiet in the good way, the inhabited way, the way it was when neither of them was pretending. The John Deere arrived on a Saturday morning with more noise than Ethan thought was necessary, the delivery flatbed, the 2 technicians who drove it off and did the registration walkthrough, the quiet gathering of people along County Road 7 who happened to be driving past and happened to stop. He signed the inspection sheet and thanked the technicians by name. Then he went inside, made coffee, reviewed his notebook for 40 minutes, and went out to begin. What he did with the machine over the following weeks was a source of genuine confusion to everyone who observed it. He didn't run it at full capacity. He ran it slowly, precisely, in patterns that didn't correspond to standard field management practice. He divided the 43 acres he had leased from a family called the Warners, an elderly couple who had stopped farming actively 5 years ago, and rented the land in large blocks to whoever offered reasonable terms into what appeared from the road to be an almost arbitrary grid of smaller sections, each worked differently, each receiving different treatment. Rick Dalton drove past 3 times in the first week and stopped once, watching from the road with his window down. The machine was expensive and powerful, and it was being operated like a precision instrument, not a commercial farming tool. He's dividing the field, Rick reported at Harlan's that Thursday. Like a chessboard. Different depths, different patterns. It doesn't make any sense as a production strategy. What Ethan was actually doing was something he had written a paper about 8 years ago, which had been published in a journal with a modest circulation and cited by 6 subsequent researchers, and largely ignored by the commercial farming industry, because it was not immediately applicable to large-scale production models, precision microzone cultivation, the idea that a single field is not a single growing environment, but a collection of microsystems, variations in soil composition, moisture retention, sun exposure, drainage that, if mapped and treated individually, could produce dramatically different output profiles than uniform treatment. The 43 Warner acres had, over the previous 22 months, been the subject of Ethan's most careful observation. He knew the soil profile at 18 different locations. He knew where the water table was shallower in early spring. He knew which sections held nitrogen more efficiently, which were prone to compaction, which benefited from lighter tillage versus aggressive aeration. The expensive machine was not there to farm the land efficiently in the conventional sense. It was there to prepare the land, with a precision that only that level of equipment could achieve, to calibrate the ground itself, zone by zone, for a very specific output. Not bulk grain, not commodity corn or soybeans, which was what every other operation in the county produced, which sold at whatever the market offered on delivery day, which required volume to generate margin, which required expensive inputs that compressed that margin further. Ethan was growing specialty produce, heritage varieties, 2 specific root crops that commanded radically different prices from the right buyers. A leafy green cultivar that had been largely displaced from commercial agriculture, but was experiencing renewed demand from a segment of the food industry that valued consistency and chemical-free certification over volume. The bulk of what he planted in the first 2 months would look, to any observer, underwhelming. He knew that. He had planned for that. The visual language of specialty cultivation does not read as success to eyes trained on commodity yields. The plants are smaller, more dispersed, less dramatic. They do not fill a field in the satisfying, photogenic way that a stand of corn does. What they do is concentrate value into a smaller, more controlled output. Lily came to the field on 2 Saturdays and walked the rows with him while he took readings and made notes. She brought her sketchbook. The drawings she made were not of plants, but of the field as a whole, the geometric division of zones, the varying heights and textures of different sections, rendered in colored pencil, with an accuracy that surprised him. On the 2nd Saturday, she pointed to the section in the southwest corner, where the ground held water slightly longer than the rest. "That part looks different," she said. "It is different," Ethan said. "Different soil, different needs." She looked at her drawing, then at the field. "So you're treating each part like its own thing?" "Yes." She seemed to consider this for a long moment. "That makes sense," she said simply, and went back to her drawing. He watched her bent over the sketchbook, the sun on the back of her neck, the field around them both. He thought, this is why, not just for her, but that she would grow up watching something finished, watching a plan execute, watching patience pay. That was not a small thing to give a child. He went back to his readings. The Midsummer Report, as understood by the community of Larimer County, was not encouraging. The Warner fields looked, by any conventional measure, behind schedule. The yield density that a 43-acre lease should be producing by August was clearly not materializing. Several of the sections appeared sparse. The plants were small, uniform, and oddly tended, staked in a few places, mulched in others, irrigated by a drip system Ethan had installed in May, using equipment he had sourced from 3 different suppliers. Rick Dalton, who had driven past the fields, so often it had become something close to a habit, stopped at the diner one morning and said to no one in particular, "That man is going to walk away with nothing. You can see it from the road." Dave Sutton, who was more measured by nature, said, "Could be he's got something else planned." "What else?" Rick said. "It's farming. You plant, you grow, you sell. He's not doing any of that right." Dave stirred his coffee. He had watched Ethan work on his own property for 2 years, and had formed a private opinion about the man that he did not share at the diner, because he was not certain enough in it, and because Larimer County's social ecosystem did not reward premature contrarianism. He said nothing more. Ethan knew how it looked. He had known how it would look from the beginning, which was one reason he had told no one what he was doing. Not because he was secretive by nature, but because the plan required a specific sequence of outcomes that would not survive being observed and commented upon in real time by people invested in its failure. By late August, he had a problem. Not with the crops; those were proceeding within acceptable parameters. 3 sections were performing above projection. One section, the north-central zone where he had misjudged the drainage, had underperformed, and he had adjusted mid-cycle, losing approximately 3 weeks of optimal growth in that area. The problem was financial. The lease on the machine, the inputs, the drip irrigation, the specialty seeds, all of it had drawn down his reserves further than his original model had projected. He was 14% over budget. He had enough to get through harvest and initial processing, but only if nothing else went wrong. One evening in late August, while Lily slept, he sat at the kitchen table with his notebook and a calculator, and went through every number twice. Then he went through them a third time, because he had learned early in his research career that the third pass always found something the first 2 missed. The third pass found nothing new. The numbers were the numbers. He closed the notebook. He sat in the quiet kitchen with the window open and the late summer air coming through, carrying the smell of cut grass and far-off rain. He thought about what he had told Lily. "Then we'll know exactly what we did wrong." He was not ready to use that sentence. Not yet. He wrote 3 lines in the notebook, new lines at the bottom of the last page. Hold the timeline. Do not accelerate. Trust the data. Then he went to bed. Harvest at the Warner Fields happened over 5 days in the second week of September. Ethan had hired 2 people to help a quiet woman in her 50s named Deanna, who had done agricultural work her whole life and asked no questions, and a young man named Colin, who was between seasons at a research greenhouse in the next county and had skills in careful, selective harvesting that commercial pickers did not possess. He paid both of them above what the work was typically worth, because the work was not typical, and because he needed it done with a precision that could not be rushed. Word traveled, as it always did. By the 3rd day of harvest, there were people slowing their trucks on County Road 7, not stopping, just slowing, observing from the road. The same instinct that makes people watch demolitions, the anticipation of collapse. What they saw was not dramatic. The yield was real, visibly real. Crates, filling slowly and carefully, products sorted and handled with unusual deliberateness. But the volume was clearly not commercial scale. Anyone who understood farming at a glance could see that the acreage had not produced at commodity rates. Rick Dalton stopped his truck on the 4th day and rolled down his window. Ethan was in the middle rows, working alongside Deanna with the focused attention of a man doing surgical rather than agricultural work. He looked up, registered Rick's presence, and went back to work. Rick drove on without saying anything. On the 5th day, Ethan returned the John Deere. He drove it to the ag-release facility in Millhaven himself, which required calling ahead to arrange a ride back. Patricia was there when he brought it in. She processed the return documentation with professional efficiency and said nothing about the general atmosphere of the transaction, which Ethan appreciated. He was back in Larimer by early afternoon. The news of the return spread by evening. At Harlan's that night, Rick Dalton's table was not laughing. The mood was something closer to the uncomfortable satisfaction of people who have predicted something they didn't actually want to happen. $180,000 for one harvest, Rick said. Whatever he made from that field, he lost. Gerald Hoff, the retired seed salesman, looked into his beer. He had been watching this story develop for months and had formed the uncomfortable suspicion that he was missing something, the way you miss a punchline because you've already laughed. Unless, Gerald said, and then stopped. Unless what? Brent said. Gerald shook his head. Nothing. Probably nothing. He went home earlier than usual that night and sat on his porch for a long time, looking at nothing in particular. 3 days after the tractor went back, a flatbed arrived at Ethan's property on County Road 7 carrying equipment that looked, to anyone driving past, like the contents of a failed commercial kitchen or a salvage yard acquisition, a stainless steel drying rack system, an industrial sorting table, a mobile cold press unit from a manufacturer that had gone out of business in 2018, acquired at auction, a commercial food-grade packaging station with a heat sealer and label printer, a small climate-controlled storage unit, second-hand, the kind used by research facilities. None of it was new. All of it was functional, verified, and appropriate for what he needed. The total cost was $14,200. The people who drove past and saw the equipment being unloaded reached a collective conclusion within 24 hours. Ethan Cole had spent his last meaningful money on junk, following a failed harvest with a failed second act, the trajectory of a man who had already lost and was now simply completing the arc. Carol Dunmore, who was not a judgmental person, came to the house that Friday evening and sat with Ethan while Lily was in her room. She had brought a casserole, which she did not present as charity, but as the natural behavior of neighbors. "People are talking," she said. "I know," Ethan said. "Is there anything you want me to know?" He looked at her across the kitchen table. Carol Dunmore had known him for 3 years and had never asked for an explanation of anything, which was one of her great qualities. "I'm okay," he said. "The plan is intact." She nodded once, the way she did when she decided a thing was true. "Good. The casserole is chicken and rice." After she left, he worked until midnight. The processing setup was not decorative. In the week following the harvest, he had transported his output in temperature-controlled containers, a critical detail he had prepared for, to a leased refrigerated space. He had arranged 3 months in advance at a cold storage facility, Millhaven. The crops were alive and viable. Now he needed to process them. What he was creating was not a product in the commodity sense. It was a portfolio of highly standardized, certified organic specialty items in specific grading and packaging configurations that matched the purchasing specifications of a particular tier of food buyers, restaurant groups, specialty grocers, and prepared food manufacturers who sourced ingredients by quality profile rather than price per pound. Ethan had spent 6 weeks of evenings over the previous winter identifying these buyers, studying their purchasing patterns, and building a catalog of product specifications that would meet their requirements. He had not yet approached a single one. The approach had to follow the product. The product had to be verifiable. The verification required the processing capability he had just assembled. He worked with a precision that Deanna, who returned to help him with the processing phase, described privately to her husband that evening as like watching someone do math in their hands. She was not wrong. Each lot was graded, measured, documented. Each packaging configuration was logged against a specific buyer profile. The label design, simple, direct, accurate, had been developed by a graphic design student in Fort Collins, who Ethan had hired for $400 and a clear brief. By the end of the first week of processing, he had 23 distinct product lots ready for approach. He sat down at the kitchen table, opened his laptop, and sent the first 12 outreach messages. The story of who Ethan Cole had been, who he actually was. Underneath the 2 years of day, labor and quiet observation, came to light not through any confession on his part, but through the gradual accumulation of outcomes that required an explanation. The explanation was this. He had received his graduate degree in agricultural systems science from Colorado State University and had spent 3 years as a research associate at a land-grant institution before transitioning to a private agricultural research consultancy where he had worked for 8 years on a specific problem: the economics of small acreage premium production and why the standard American model of commodity farming had consistently failed to generate sustainable income for producers below a certain scale threshold. His conclusions, developed across multiple papers and consulting engagements, were not complicated. They were, in fact, obvious in retrospect, which is the nature of conclusions that require a great deal of work to arrive at. Commodity farming rewards volume. Volume requires scale. Scale requires capital. Capital requires either existing wealth or debt. And debt at the margins of agricultural production is, historically and structurally, a poverty trap. Farmers below the threshold scale spend their entire productive lives chasing a margin that was never large enough to begin with. The exit from this trap, Ethan had argued, was not to farm more. It was to farm differently, to produce not what the commodity market demanded, but what a different, more discriminating market was willing to pay a premium for, and to produce it with such precision and consistency that the premium became reliable rather than aspirational. The problem with this approach, as he had written in 2019, was that it required a paradox. To produce premium specialty output, you needed to prepare the land with precision that only expensive equipment could achieve. But the revenue from a single premium season was not sufficient to justify owning that equipment outright. You needed the capability for one season to establish the system, then the system to generate the revenue, then the revenue to sustain the operation with simpler, cheaper tools. He had called this, in the paper, the calibration season. He had always known, writing it, that he was also writing a personal plan. The plan required everything he had. He had waited until he had enough. And then carefully, methodically, having watched the specific land he intended to use for almost 2 years, he had executed it. The John Deere was the calibration tool. It had been used not to farm in the conventional sense, but to prepare 43 acres with laboratory-grade precision, establishing soil conditions and structural profiles that a much simpler, cheaper, ongoing operation could maintain. He had known, from the first day, that he would return it. That was always the plan. The difficult part, the part he had not written about, because it was not a research insight but a human reality, was doing this with no margin, no safety net, and a child watching from the farmhouse window. He had thought about that part a great deal. He had decided it was still the right thing to do. The response to his outreach came faster than his most optimistic projection. This surprised him, mildly, not because he had doubted the quality of the product, but because the specialty food sourcing industry was, in his experience, cautious and slow to engage with unknown producers. It typically took 2 or 3 contact cycles before a buyer would commit to even a sample evaluation. The acceleration, he learned, was partly due to a structural shift in the market he had tracked but underweighted. 2 of the premium produce suppliers, who had previously served the restaurant segment he was targeting, had experienced significant quality inconsistency issues in the previous growing season, and buyers were actively looking for alternatives. He was, by accident of timing, arriving precisely when the door was open. The first substantive response came from a food service procurement manager named Susan Travers, based in Denver, who sourced ingredients for a group of 11 farm-to-table restaurants across Colorado and southern Wyoming. She had received his outreach email with the product catalog and certification documentation on a Thursday morning and called him that same afternoon. "Your specification sheet is unusual," she said. It was not a compliment or a criticism. It was an observation. "I document to lab standards," Ethan said. "I can see that. Most small producers send me handwritten notes and a photograph." A pause. "I'd like to see a sample lot. Can you get something to me by next week?" "Yes," Ethan said. He drove to Denver on Monday with a carefully packaged sample selection in a refrigerated container he had borrowed from the cold storage facility. He had called ahead to Susan's office, confirmed the delivery window, arrived on time, and left without pressing for a response. Susan Travers called him on Wednesday. "I showed these to 3 of our executive chefs," she said. The feedback was consistent. "They want to know if you can supply on a recurring basis." "I can," Ethan said, which was true for the current season's processed inventory. The follow-on seasons, that was the next plan. Already in outline form in the notebook. "What are your pricing minimums?" he told her. The line was quiet for 3 seconds. "That's significantly above commodity pricing." "It should be," Ethan said. "The product profile is not comparable to commodity." "No," she said slowly. "It isn't." They negotiated for 40 minutes. The agreement they reached was not a single purchase. It was a framework, a recurring supply arrangement for the following 2 growing seasons, with pricing indexed to quality verification at each delivery, with an option to expand scope pending the first season's performance. Ethan sat in his truck in the parking structure beneath Susan's building for a few minutes after the call ended. He had run the numbers before the call. He had run them again during. He had run them in his head one more time while she talked. The contract value, at the agreed pricing, exceeded his total expenditure for the calibration season, the lease, the inputs, the processing equipment by a margin he had projected as the optimistic scenario. He was in the optimistic scenario. He started the truck and drove home. He said nothing to Lily that evening. He made dinner, asked about her day, listened to the particulars of a school project on plant photosynthesis that she had apparently become more interested in than strictly required, and did the dishes. That night, after she was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table and opened the notebook to a fresh page and wrote a single line. Season 1. Complete. The story moved through Larimer County, in the way significant stories always move, not as a single announcement but as a series of pieces assembling themselves in different minds at different speeds, until suddenly everyone had the picture at the same time. The Millhaven Gazette ran a brief item about a local specialty produce operation that had secured a multi-season supply contract with a Denver restaurant group. The item named Ethan Cole. It was 3 paragraphs, positioned below a story about a high school football team's scheduling change. It did not require 3 paragraphs to change the atmosphere of the county. It required only one. Gerald Hoff read it on a Thursday morning and felt the specific discomfort of a man who had almost figured something out and then stopped. He had thought unless at Harlan's, and then let the thought dissolve. The unless had turned out to be real. Rick Dalton read it at the diner. He read it twice. He set the newspaper down and looked out the window at the street for a while, without speaking. Dave Sutton, sitting across from him, said nothing, because Dave Sutton was a man who understood the value of silence in precise moments. He knew, Rick said finally. Looks like it, Dave said. The whole time he was out there with that tractor doing whatever he was doing, he knew. Seems that way. Rick picked up his coffee, set it down again. The thing about Rick Dalton, the thing that was worth acknowledging, was that he was capable of honesty with himself in private moments. Even when that honesty was uncomfortable, he sat with the discomfort now, in the public privacy of the diner, and let it exist. I was wrong about him, he said. Dave nodded once. I was wrong about what he was doing, and wrong about why. Dave nodded again, because there was nothing more useful to add. At the feed store, at the gas station, along the roads between farms, the news settled like a change in pressure. People who had laughed, or listened to laughter, or stayed silent in the face of laughter, now navigated the particular social awkwardness of having been publicly wrong about something they had been publicly certain of. Most of them handled it by not looking directly at the subject of their error, which is the default human approach to shame. Carol Dunmore told Ethan, with a directness he appreciated, "People feel like fools." They shouldn't, Ethan said. They made a reasonable judgment based on what they could see. The judgment was unkind, Carol said. Yes, he acknowledged. It was. But the information gap was real. He was not performing magnanimity. He had, during the long months of the plan, genuinely not had space to carry resentment. Resentment required attention he needed elsewhere. It was a simple resource allocation. Lily found out about the contract through a classmate who had heard from her mother, and came home from school that Friday with the news already on her face before she had opened the door. People at school are saying you sold stuff, she said. I did, Ethan said. She came into the kitchen and sat down across from him. Was it the plan? The plan you had? Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Did it work the way you thought? Close enough, he said. She looked at him with the deep, steady attention she brought to things she was thinking about seriously. Were you scared? He considered giving her the comfortable answer. He decided she was old enough for the real one. Yes. In the middle part, she nodded slowly, absorbing this. But you didn't stop. No. Because you knew it was right, or because you were too far in to stop? He looked at his daughter for a moment, this 8-year-old, who asked questions that adults rarely managed. Both, he said. At the beginning, I knew it was right. In the middle, I was too far in to stop. By the end, it turned out I was right. That's not always how it goes. She seemed to find this satisfactory. She went to the counter and got herself a glass of water and said, "Can I show you something?" and led him to her room, where she had pinned the drawing she had made at the field, the geometric sections of the 43 acres above her desk. She had added something to it since he had last seen it. Small, color-coded notations in each section, matching, he realized with a start, the data he had shown her on one of their Saturday visits. Soil types, output categories, she had remembered. "I mapped it," she said. "Like you do in your notebook." He stood looking at the drawing for a long time. "Bud," he said. "Yeah? That's very good." She looked at it with the critical assessment of someone who already knew its flaws and was planning the next version. "I'm going to do season 2 when you start," she said. He left her room and went back to the kitchen. The county had gone quiet. He had not asked it to. He had not planned for it as a goal. It was a byproduct of doing something correctly that people had assumed he would do badly. The quiet was temporary. Counties are not permanently impressed by anyone, and he had no interest in managing it. He had interest in season 2. He opened the notebook. On a Friday in late October, Rick Dalton drove down County Road 7 and turned into Ethan's property without calling ahead. Ethan was on the back porch, working on item 15 on his repair list, a section of trim above the kitchen window that had separated from its backing and let water in during rain. He came around the side of the house when he heard the truck, because he had heard it before he saw it. Rick stepped out. He was wearing his regular work clothes, not anything formal, which told Ethan this was not a rehearsed visit. Rick stood by the door of his truck for a moment with a manner that did not quite know what to do with itself. "I heard about the contract," Rick said. "Okay," Ethan said. "From the paper. And from Dave. And from about 4 other people." He paused. "Sounds like it went well." It went well. Rick looked at the house, then at the fields behind it. Not the Warner fields, those were a mile up the road, but the modest yard, and the small outbuildings, and the visible evidence of a life managed carefully on limited resources. "I said things," Rick said, "at Harlan's, and other places." "I know," Ethan said. "I didn't know what you were doing." "No. You couldn't have." "I could have." Rick stopped. Started again. "I could have been less certain about what I assumed." Ethan looked at him. Rick Dalton was not a small man in any sense. And the posture of this visit, the standing by the truck, the working up to a thing, was costing him something real. Ethan recognized the cost and did not inflate the transaction. "People see what they can see," Ethan said. "You saw a day laborer making what looked like a bad decision. That's a reasonable thing to see. It was wrong. Yes, it was wrong." The two men stood in the quiet of a Friday afternoon in October. The fields around them were bare and brown, the sky low and gray with the first suggestion of coming cold. A crow landed on the fence post at the edge of the yard, looked at them both, and left. "I'd like to talk about next season," Rick said, "if you're open to it. About whether there's a way to, I don't know how this works exactly, a partnership, or a consulting arrangement, or whatever makes sense to you." Ethan considered this. He had, before Rick arrived, given no particular thought to the question of Rick Dalton in his future plans. Rick had 300 acres of productive land and the capital and equipment infrastructure that Ethan lacked. Rick had the social authority in the county that made certain arrangements easier. Rick also had the particular pride structure of a man who had never been significantly wrong before, which was either an obstacle or a motivation, depending on how the partnership was structured. "I'm open to talking," Ethan said. "Not yes. Not enthusiasm." A door left ajar. Rick nodded. He seemed to find this sufficient. "I'll call ahead next time," he said. "I appreciate that," Ethan said. Rick got back in his truck. He drove down the gravel to the road and turned north toward his own land. Ethan watched the truck until it was out of sight. Then he went back to item 15 on the repair list, the trim piece, the water ingress, the practical immediate problem that needed addressing before the first significant rain. He picked up his tools. That evening, Lily spread her colored pencils across the kitchen table and made a new drawing. Not the field this time, but the house. The repaired sections marked in a slightly different shade than the rest, the work visible in the work. She held it up. "Is this right?" He looked at it. The patched roof over the second bedroom, rendered in the careful observation of a child who noticed things. The drain pipe along the north wall. The porch corner, still on the list. It's exactly right, he said. She taped it to the wall beside the field drawing. The two drawings side by side, the plan and the home, the methodology and the life. He made dinner, she set the table. The house was warm, and the October dark came early at this latitude, and there was nothing particular to celebrate, because the plan had worked, the way a plan is supposed to work, and celebration is for surprises. This had not been a surprise. He had known, from the first morning he drove the machine onto the Warner Fields, that the land had what he thought it had. He had known it from 22 months of careful watching. He had known it from 11 years of research, and a career built on understanding systems from the inside rather than from a distance. What he had not known, what no amount of research methodology could have predicted, was whether he had the nerve to execute it with everything on the line, and a child watching. He had. The knowledge of that was quiet and internal, and did not require an audience. The notebook sat on the counter, open to a fresh page. He had written 3 words at the top. The beginning of the Season 2 outline. Start with soil, which was where everything started, which was where he had always started, which was the irreducible first principle of the thing he actually knew how to do, and had always known how to do, and was finally doing in the place and circumstances of his actual life, rather than in the abstract domain of research methodology. Outside, the October wind moved through the bare fields of Larimer County, which had stopped laughing and had not yet figured out a new posture. Ethan Cole was not waiting for it to figure one out. He was already at work on what came next. The notebook was open. The page was filling,